I'd like to start by not only thanking the organisers of the conference, but for inviting me to speak on this theme, but also I'd like to congratulate them. Not, of course, congratulate them for inviting me, but I'd like to congratulate them for asking me to speak about the issue of Russophobia, because I think that by extending that invitation, the organisers have shown great perspicacity, because as I will try to show, I believe that Russophobia is perhaps the most important political issue of our time. I'm sure that suggestion will surprise some of you, but I will try to explain why I believe it to be the case. Thank you.
We've got it up as loud as we can get it.
When I say that it's the most important political issue of the day, I'm not just referring to the fact that Russia seems to be in the news all the time. As we know, Russia is accused of manipulating practically every single political event that happens, whether it's the Brexit referendum or the election of Trump. We all know that the Trump presidency has been hobbled by the Russiagate inquiry for 2 years. And we also, of course, all know that Russia is accused of all kinds of crimes and unjust actions in the international arena, whether it's the events in Salisbury or the much bigger events in Ukraine and Syria. But I'm not just referring to the fact that Russia appears to be in the news all the time. What I'm referring to when I say that Russophobia is the most important, or perhaps one of the most important issues of the day, is the fact that I think that Russophobia, in fact, is nothing to do with Russia. I've been introduced to you as an expert on Russia, but actually I'm not going to talk about Russia. I'm going to talk about Russophobia, which, and this is my argument that I'm presenting to you, is in fact nothing to do with Russia at all, or very little to do with Russia, but is instead a consequence of certain tendencies, certain political campaigns, certain movements in our own Western societies. And Russophobia is, as it were, the expression of these tendencies. And the second reason why I would like to congratulate the organisers on suggesting this as a topic is that I have the impression, but I don't yet know you as a group, that what I'm going to say is seldom, if ever, said in Britain. What I'm going to say to you is pretty standard issue in nationalist or patriotic circles in France, where I live, in Germany, in Austria, not of course in the whole of Germany, but in the, we've heard from the Alternative for Sweden, but in the equivalent party in Germany, in the AfD, absolutely, I think they agree with me completely on all these issues. The same goes for the Freedom Party in Austria, the same goes for the League in Italy, and so on. So I'm extremely pleased to be speaking about this subject in Britain, because I do believe that it is a subject that isn't raised enough in this country. Instead, it's a fairly standard issue on the continent where I live, and far would it be from me to congratulate the Traditional Britain group for being in the vanguard. I hope, on the contrary, you're in the rear guard and that you will stay there fighting for reaction. But I do think that you have opened a very important debate by raising this subject. Now, I've said then that Russophobia is an expression of certain tendencies within Western society. And I'd like to divide my analysis into three areas. The first, and today's a good day to be talking about it, with the debates in the House of Commons, the first is the link between Russophobia and European unity. I'm going to argue that there is an organic link between Russophobia and European unity throughout the centuries, and indeed for practically 1,000 years. The second area in which I think Russophobia displays or reveals things about the way the West is run is that for the last 25 years since or 30 years now since the end of communism, the West, in my view, the United States and its European allies, has pursued a policy on the international level of chaos. particularly by supporting revolutions, colour revolutions, the Arab Spring and so on. And Russia, by contrast, on the international arena, has emerged, particularly in the last decade, as an opponent of this policy of chaos, and instead as a state which embodies order in the international arena, against this rather nihilistic Western policy of chaos. And the third issue, which I think Russophobia reveals, is, of course, the abandonment by Western societies of traditional values. Russia is hated because she embodies, or appears to embody, a traditional view of society which liberalism in the West has completely destroyed and is continuing to destroy with the kind of immigration policies that earlier speakers have referred to. If we start with the issue of European unity and its link to Russophobia, I'm often struck by a quotation from Napoleon, who wrote to his Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, in 1812, shortly before launching the Russia campaign. He wrote to Fouché, I'm quoting from memory, he said, "What I want from this campaign is for Europe to be politically united, for Europe to have one legal system, for Europe to have one currency, for Europe to have one system of administration, and for Paris to be the capital of the world." And he concludes his letter to Fouché, he says, "That is the only outcome that I will accept from this Russia campaign." Now, I'm sure many of you know the history of the 1812 campaign. I recently reread Adam Zamoyski's account of it. Dominic Lieben's is very good as well. In Zamoyski's book, it's very clear that that campaign, which of course, as we know, ended in disaster, did indeed seem to be senseless. There was no real understanding, or there seemed to be no real understanding of why Napoleon launched this campaign. But this letter to Fouché, I think, is very revealing and helps us to understand the real reasons for what, of course, ended up being a complete failure. The same can be said for the Second World War. Some of you may know a book I wrote in 1997 called The Tainted Source, The Undemocratic Origins of the European Idea. It has a long chapter, the first chapter, on Nazi European ideology. As far as I know, it's the only chapter that anybody's ever read, because all the rest of it is about other subjects. But in that first chapter, where I discuss Nazi European ideology, I did so partly because I discovered that there was a lot of it in the 30s, and particularly in the 1940s, not just in Nazi Germany, but in the occupied countries where a real European ideology was developed, which had a lot of similarities, as I show in the book, with the European ideology of today. But what is certainly clear, if you want to look up the book, it's available as an e-book, is that this European ideology was particularly strong after the 22nd of June 1941, in other words, after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. That war, which of course was a bit like Napoleon's invasion, fought by not just by Germans, but by other nationalities fighting together with them, Romanians and people from Western Europe as well. That campaign, the Barbarossa campaign, was fought specifically in the name of European unity. Europe against Bolshevism. So with Hitler we have a second example after Napoleon of how European unity, imperial European unity, is organically linked to Russophobia and hatred of the barbaric East. The same goes for Charlemagne's empire. When Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800, his act, which, as you know, made him emperor of the Frankish kingdom, which included France and Germany and large parts of Italy, and of course the Low Countries. That empire, which corresponds to some extent to the territory of the original 6 member states of the European Economic Community, that empire was in many ways an admirable construction, and in some ways a paradigm for a Christian state. And so we can look on it with a considerable amount of sympathy and indulgence, if we like. It's a long time ago, so we don't need to politicize it. But what's often forgotten is that what was so peculiar about Charlemagne's decision to crown himself or to be crowned emperor is that, of course, there was already a Roman emperor at that point in Constantinople. So his proclamation of himself as Roman emperor was an act of rupture with the Eastern Roman Empire based in Byzantium. Therefore we can say that, as with the other historical examples that I have mentioned, this idea of imperial European unity, of the kind that Brexit is of course rejecting, is always conjugated with a rejection of the east of Europe. It's just an inevitable logical conclusion of such attempts. And I believe very strongly that the same historical rule applies in the history of the European Union. What people don't often appreciate, and this is because the official history of the European Union is, of course, like everything else about the European Union, a pack of lies. What they sometimes don't appreciate is that the founding act of what later became the European Economic Community, and later still the European Union, the founding act of what they call the European construction, the Schuman Declaration of the 9th of May 1950, was 100% an element of the Cold War. The Cold War, which many people I expect in this room, and certainly it's true of me, probably supported as such, to the extent that we were, of course, against communism. But nonetheless, as observers, we must conclude that it was part of the Cold War. The European construction was conceived as an element of the Cold War, and we can see this in the temporal proximity between the Schuman Declaration of the 9th of May 1950 and the Pleven Plan. René Pleven was the French Prime Minister at the time, presented a few months later on the 4th of October 1950. The point about the Schuman Declaration, which, as you probably know, amalgamated coal and steel production between France and Germany, but excluded, quite deliberately, the biggest coal and steel producer of the time, which was, of course, the United Kingdom, was an attempt to create a federal unit in order to wage, or be able to wage, a terrestrial war against the Soviet Union. We must never forget the absolutely key role of the Cold War in creating the first European institutions. To put it very simply, the Korean War had broken out in June, and the Allies were afraid that the same thing as had happened in Korea would happen in Europe, and that Soviet forces would invade Western Europe. And they looked at the figures, they looked at the amount of tanks the Russians had, they looked at the amount of soldiers and tanks in the West, and they decided, the Americans decided in September 1950, to effect a 180-degree change in their policy towards Germany, which up until then had been a policy of neutralizing Germany militarily, and instead to rearm Germany. Dean Acheson summoned Ernest Bevin and Robert Schuman, the French Foreign Minister, to New York, and he told him, "I want to see the Germans in uniform by the end of the year." And Schuman decided that French public opinion was not ready for this, because France, of course, had been occupied only 5 years previously, and so they decided to give it a European label, European packaging. But as I say, the temporal proximity of the Schuman Declaration with the attempt in the Pleven Plan of the 4th of October 1950 to create a European defence community, in other words, to create a European army, the temporal proximity of these two declarations, the European army was never created, it was vetoed in 1954 by Gaullists and communists, but the fact that these two things go together show, I think, once again, this absolutely organic link between imperial or federal European unity and hostility to the East. Whether or not it was justified at the time is irrelevant for the purposes of this analysis. And I furthermore believe that the creation of a single currency at the Maastricht as you know, concluded at the Maastricht summit in 1991, was also profoundly linked to what was happening in the east of Europe. We must never forget, but it is unfortunately often forgotten, that the Maastricht summit took place on the 9th and 10th of December 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union having been proclaimed by the Bellevesher Accords of the 8th of December 1991. In other words, the Maastricht Treaty, which led to which two absolutely essential decisions were taken. One was to recognize the secessionist states in Yugoslavia, and the other was to create a single currency. That summit took place in conditions of unprecedented geopolitical chaos. The Soviet Union, as I say, its dissolution had been announced the day before the summit met. And it's not fanciful, on the contrary, to see in the project of creating a single currency a desire to create a geopolitical bloc, with obviously Germany and the other core countries at the center of it, and other peripheral countries orbiting around this hard core, as they called it at the time, in response to this geopolitical vacuum that had opened up in the east of Europe through the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So at all these stages of the European construction, we can see this link between imperial or federal European unity and hostility to the east. And today, of course, now 20 years after the creation of the single currency, we see Russophobia being used. I work in the European Parliament, so I see it every day. We see Russophobia being used to bolster internal cohesion within a European Union, which, as we know, is riven by all kinds of internal tensions, north, south, and east and west. So that's my first point, that Russophobia is, if you like, an instrument for creating a united Europe. The second point I want to make is about the dichotomy between chaos, a policy of chaos, and a policy of order. Once again, I'm trying not to talk about Russia. I'm instead trying to talk about our own societies and what is going on here. It's not a matter of saying that everything in Russia is perfect or whatever, although, as you'll soon understand, there are many things I approve of. But the essential point is to analyze and criticize what's happening in our own states. And as I've indicated just now, my view is that for the last 25 or 30 years, the Western states, the Americans and their European allies, have pursued a policy of chaos, a policy of revolution and of chaos. They call it, of course, regime change, but regime change used to be known as revolution. And it's the deepest paradox that, having fought the Cold War for 50 years, the Western powers, after the end of the Cold War, took upon themselves the mantle of revolution and became the prime movers of revolution, certainly in the European continent, to some extent around the world, but in the European continent and in the Middle East. When I talk about revolution, I'm referring to events like the NATO attack on Yugoslavia in 1999, which was of course intended to overthrow the then president, and which succeeded in doing so a year later. I'm referring to the louder. Sounds like I'm shouting at you.
Raise up the mic.
I can't. I'm referring to that event, the NATO attack of 1999. I'm referring, of course, also to the Iraq War of 2003, which, as we all know, plunged that country into unimaginable chaos, which lasted a decade. I'm referring to the attack on Libya in 2011, which, as we know, brought Islamist mob to power. A mob which, as we know, assassinated Colonel Gaddafi in the most hideously violent way imaginable while shouting Allahu Akbar. An event which, when she heard about it, Hillary Clinton laughed. And I'm referring, of course, more topically perhaps, by the way, as I don't need to tell you, the Libyan intervention, of course, unleashed or helped to unleash the wave of migration crossing the Mediterranean, which we all know about, because, of course, state power collapsed in Libya and still hasn't been re-established. And I'm referring, of course, also to the Western intervention in Syria in support of people that we now know after, 7 years of bloodshed in that country were in fact Islamist rebels and not Democrats as we were originally told. These major military interventions are only part of a much bigger picture, including all the colour revolutions which were sponsored. George Soros has been mentioned just now by our Polish friend. Soros deployed over the whole of post-communist Europe, together with the American state and its organs, particularly the National Endowment for Democracy. They deployed together a huge network of NGOs all over Eastern Europe who were able, at given moments, to be activated as revolutionary cells. And we've seen this again and again. We've seen it in Ukraine in 2004, and again in 2014. We saw it in Georgia with the Rose Revolution in 2004, in Central Asia. We see it, of course, with the Arab Spring, where many of the technicians from Serbia went, for example, to Egypt at the beginning of the Arab Spring to teach the Egyptians how to overthrow their government. And, of course, we see it, we've seen it as well, obviously, in Syria, as I've just said. So this policy of chaos found an opponent in Russia. Essentially from 2007 onwards, when Vladimir Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference and explained his opposition to what he then called the unipolar world, and said that instead the international system had to be based on multipolarity and above all on a respect for national sovereignty and the existing rules of the international order. And over the decades since that speech in 2007, Russia has indeed, from an international relations point of view, emerged, and the Syrian case is perhaps the best example of this, as a conservative force in international relations. Conservative, I'm not talking about cultural conservatism, I'm talking at this stage about international relations alone. I'll move on to the cultural conservatism in a minute. A conservative force because, as the Syrian example shows us very clearly, its foreign policy is based on support for constituted states and for the territorial integrity of states. The intervention in Syria from 2015 was designed to ensure that Libya would not be repeated a second time, and that Syria would be maintained as a state with a functioning government. The Western policy had been, on the contrary, to divide up Syria, rather on the Lebanese model, and to sow chaos instead of statehood. And one of the, to me, most striking illustrations of this difference in approach is the difference between the Kosovo independence of 2008 and the reintegration of Crimea into the Russian Federation in 2014. One of the reasons why I think, apart from the obvious geostrategic reasons, the Black Sea Fleet and so on in Sebastopol, one of the reasons I think why this Crimea annexation, or reintegration as the Russians say, created such fury in the West was precisely that it was a national and state-based operation. Russia could have could have done what the West did with Kosovo, which is to proclaim an independence or support a proclamation of independence, which in reality in the Kosovo case is absolutely no independence at all. If you read the Declaration of the Independence of Kosovo, it's actually a declaration of dependence on the European Union and NATO. The Kosovo Declaration of Independence requires NATO to be present on its territory and requires a High Representative from the European Union to govern the province. So this is a bogus postmodern independence, and it fits into this rather nihilistic, I would say, Heraclitean Western policy for political situations that are unclear. And that's the radical difference, I think, with the Crimea annexation. Because the appeal that was made in Russia, not of course in the West, but the appeal was made, the way that this was sold, the way that this operation was sold in Russia to Russian public opinion, was of course that it was an operation of national reunification, of state and national reunification. So philosophically, whatever you think about the rights and wrongs of the Crimea business, philosophically speaking, there is a strong difference between it and the way the West operates. So that's my second point about the attitude towards statehood and the attitude towards the international system. And Russophobia in international relations shows us, gives us an understanding, I think, a better understanding of how the West operates. We can, of course, debate what we think about Russia's behavior. That's fair enough. But my purpose in underlining this to you is to say that these things, I believe, reveal the way we are operating more than the way they are operating. And the last point I'd like to make is that Russophobia is a consequence, an inevitable consequence, of the deeply corrosive liberalism which permeates all Western European societies. I'm sure you all know that the European Constitution, the ill-fated European Constitution of 2005, had no reference to Europe's Christian roots, Christian heritage. It's a well-known story. People are perhaps less well aware that in one of the early drafts of the European Constitution, Giscard, who wrote it, Giscard d'Estaing, who wrote it, put in a quote from Thucydides. He put a quote from Pericles' funeral oration in the Peloponnesian War. And this quotation, which was a quotation about Athenian democracy, remained in the draft until a few weeks before the Constitution was adopted by the European Council, until somebody put up their hand and said, we can't have a quote from Thucydides. There was slavery in Athens. Women didn't have the vote. How can we possibly take Athens as a model of European democracy? And it was taken out. I'm not making it up. It was taken out for reasons of political correctness. And I tell you this anecdote to illustrate what I'm sure you all already understand, which is that the European project, but also to a large extent the self-understanding of many European states, not Britain, I think, not Britain. I think it's fair to say Britain is different from the other European states in this regard, is a profoundly anti-historical vision. The European Union, in its founding texts, because now, of course, the Constitution is the Treaty on European Union, is a profoundly postmodern text. It is as if the history of Europe began with the writing of that text. It has no history, in fact. Europe has no history, according to this vision. Instead, we just have values. The history of Europe in the Treaty on European Union is invoked very indirectly and only as a springboard for the universal values which the European Union is said to embody. Those universal values are, guess what? Human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and so on. In other words, they are universal values. There is absolutely nothing European about them at all, in particular. They are, on the contrary, universal values. So we have this sort of disembodied, unhistorical, post-historical, post-national, post-Christian creation, which, of course, is intended to take away any sense of history, any sense of genuine national identity, any sense of national cohesion. Now, Russia, as you know, is often attacked for being a dictatorship, for being an authoritarian state, an elective dictatorship, all the rest of it. But one of the things that the Western public public opinion, or at least Western elites, cannot stand, and they mention it all the time, is the now famous Russian law against gay propaganda towards minors. In other words, the gay rights thing is the thing that really gets their goat. It really gets their goat. Why does it really get their goat? Because it is a symbol of precisely this postmodernism, this nihilistic view of society, which Western societies have all embraced, and which, of course, they also promote at the European level. It's a symbol for that. And I probably don't need to remind you that we in Britain had exactly the same law. Mrs. Thatcher voted that under the Conservatives there was exactly the same law in Britain, which was taken off the statute book about 10 years later by Tony Blair. So this idea that you shouldn't promote gay marriage or whatever in front of children in schools and so on is hardly the invention of some semi-Asiatic barbarian dictatorship. We had it here for 10 years, 10 or 15 years. Yet this now is held up as the absolute epitome of Russia's reaction against the liberal values of the West. And to be honest, and I am now going to say a word about Russia itself, there are elements in Russian society in the last 30 years since the end of communism which confirm this view. I think Russia is a conservative society. I'm certainly not going to idealize it. I think it was profoundly corrupted. The society was profoundly corrupted by 70 or 80 years of Bolshevism, and in many ways probably has still not managed to overcome that heritage. But the trend is quite remarkable. Do you know, for example, perhaps you do, that 30,000 churches, new churches, have been built since the end of communism. 800 new monasteries have been opened in Russia. 800 monasteries! You know, these are, in Western Europe, the churches are all being closed or turned into nightclubs. So this is a tendency that whatever, once again, I'm absolutely not trying to idealize it, but nonetheless, I don't think there can be any doubt that Russia is traveling in one direction and we're traveling in the opposite one. And my conclusion really is a very sad one, because it's pretty depressing. I take what our Swedish friend said about offering solutions. I totally agree with that, but I'm afraid I'm going to end on a rather depressing note. As we can see in Poland, we just heard from Poland, as we can see in Hungary, you asked a question about Hungary, as we can see actually in many post-communist countries, there's a very deep paradox. The communist regime was perceived in Russia and in those countries, in the Central European countries, in the Soviet orbit, but also in the Soviet Union itself. It was perceived as a dictatorship. It was perceived as a almost foreign regime. Obviously in Poland and so on, it was indeed a foreign regime. But even in Russia, even in Soviet Russia, it was perceived at home, among ordinary Russians, around the kitchen table, as a dictatorship. And your private space at home was your little pocket of liberty in a state that was, of course, overwhelmingly hostile. And this paradigm, this fact that Russians, like Central Europeans and Eastern Europeans, understood communism to be an insidious, stupid, boring, mediocre dictatorship, meant, and this is the paradox that I'm driving at, that certain values, including nationalism, national pride, and social conservatism, remained intact, and were indeed, in the case, for example, of Poland most famously, the very vector by which those countries then regained their freedom. And this is the paradox of the history of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. Throughout the entire Cold War, as we, I'm sure, all know in this room, Marxism flourished in the West. Every single university was left-wing. There are whole generations of Western Europeans who've been brought up on Marxism. All the leaders of the European Union some of them are so old now they've retired. Barroso, for example, who was a leader of the youth Maoist movement in Portugal at the time of the what's it called? Not Daisy Revolution. That's it. The Carnation Revolution. Time and again you find these figures. Tony Blair. The only book I've ever heard Tony Blair ever mention was Isaac Deutscher's biography of Trotsky, which he said greatly inspired him when he was at Oxford. He thought Trotsky was fabulous. We know this to be true because we are all from Western Europe, and we understand that Marxism was alive and well in our institutions for decades. In the East, including in Russia, it was then and has since been totally discredited. So we are in a position now in Western Europe where Marxism, I'm not talking about the economic aspects of Marxism, obviously not the planned economy or state ownership of the means of production, but the deeper ideological core of Marxism, namely revolution, the progressivist idea that history has an ineluctable path but which has to be fought for, and the core Leninist and Marxist view of the withering away of the state, all those ideas constitute the absolute basis of Western liberal dogma today. And the greatest paradox, as I say, is that whereas Marxism was discredited in the East and has indeed, and in a way, never penetrated the society, or at least penetrated it in a different way because, as I say, of the internal resistance which people had around their kitchen table, we can see, I think now, after 3 decades since the end of communism, that liberalism has proved to be more corrosive an ideology even than Soviet communism.